Welcome to Uncorked, a cult wines podcast where we take you behind the scenes of the fine wine market. I'm Tom Gearing, CEO of Cult Wines and your podcast host. And as always, I am joined by my co-host, Jonathan Stevenson, Jay Stevenson. I haven't actually quite landed on which one I'm going to go for this podcast. But
normally we go through both throughout the whole pod. So we'll go with Jay Jonathan.
Jay Jonathan, how are you?
Very well. Yeah,
Good.
very well.
Enjoying the new year so far?
Good start to the year, yeah, I think so. Weather's been slightly miserable, but where there's wine, there's a way. So,
well, to disappoint people at home, you are doing dry January, which a lot of people listening to this might also be doing the same thing.
Yes, yeah, attempting to. I think, given the weather, my sort of commitments to dry January will be up and down, depending on.
And we're going to put you to the test today. We are going to put you to say.
More like damp January.
Damp January. Slightly moist.
Moist January.
Yeah, exactly.
That'll catch on.
And for those of you who just heard those tones, this is our guest, of course. We're joined by Libby Brodie. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks.
For those of you who are unaware of Libby, and I'll be honest, if you like wine and you're on social media, particularly Instagram, I'll be surprised they haven't come across you because you are one of those sort of influence, shall we say, of the world that is very commonly popping up, especially on my Discover feed. So I'm sure a lot of people will be familiar with your voice. But you are a wine communicator. You'll also be well known as being a City A.M columnist. But what I wasn't aware of is your kind of background and sort of your career spanning theatre and film, as well as now in wine, which we're going to love to hear about. But, one of your things is about sort of breaking down barriers and making wine, more human, confident and approachable.
Yeah, hopefully. I mean, fingers crossed, that's what I'm trying to do with my job. So I think that when I was learning about wine, which was relatively recently, we compared to one of my colleagues, it really surprised me that I've been drinking pretty much hardcore for decades. And there was so much that I didn't know about that would just make the wine experience better. And I realized that the people I was hanging out with, my friends, they're fairly well traveled, they're fairly well educated, they're a wine drinking crowd, but they didn't know the right service temperature or what certain words on a bottle meant. And I just thought I'd love to communicate that better to people so they can enjoy this brilliant, brilliant product.
And what do we determine as hardcore drinking, if you don't mind me asking?
Well, you'd have to speak to my doctor about that. But no, I actually think I drink less now I work in wine.
Right.
Because my appreciation of it has gone up far more. So I'm drinking better quality wine. I'm drinking less of it because I'm thinking about it more. And also, I think, in your 20s, well, I don't know about you, maybe you had wonderfully pure youths, but in my 20s, it was basically, what can I get for free?
Right.
Who's buying me that drink? What the lukewarm wine at a theatre opening night? Yeah, I'll have that. Whereas I think now it's not necessarily an everyday occurrence, and there is most days, to be honest. But it is sort of drinking something better and nicer and thinking about it a bit more. Yeah,
drink less, but drink better, I think is the mantra.
Yeah.
But I mean, what was your, was there a kind of a moment which twigged for you in terms of your interest and love for wine in particular? Obviously, you talked a little bit more about just, obviously, as I'm sure we've all experienced in our early 20s, just drinking for the social fun element of it. But was there a moment that got you into wine?
Very much so. So my family they're not wine pros, should we say. And I think that is something I found quite interesting coming into the wine industry. Lots of people do seem to have a background where their parents collected, they went to wine tasting, their uncle had a cellar. I didn't. My parents had wine at every meal, I would say most meals, particularly when I was older, but it wouldn't be more than £10 a bottle max, and there wasn't a lot of knowledge going on there. But
there was a culture of having wine at the dinner table.
Yeah, you had wine, it was there, but it wasn't a necessity and it wasn't really known about in the way that I do now.
Right.
And then I went to a wine tasting with a boyfriend. It's always boys. I went to a wine tasting with a boyfriend in my early 20s, and at this tasting we had Bielka Salmon Rosé Champagne.
Yeah.
And I had this and I said, wow, that is so much better than Smirnoff Ice.
That was your benchmark.
That was my takeaway.
Yeah.
Which I actually then
it wasn't a high bar to beat as well.
Well, Smirnoff Ice is great actually. They sent me some cans recently, and it took me right back. I still love it. It's refreshing. I've got nothing. I'd rather have that than a Pinot Grigio. Anyway, so I segue from Pinot Grigio, poor thing. So basically, I did actually say that to Matthew of the house, Bielka Salmon House, at a lunch years later. And he was like, oh, great, better than Smirnoff Ice. We'll put that straight on a press release.
Yeah.
I was like, sadly, I haven't seen it yet.
Sorted,
So from then I started reading books about it, talking to sommeliers. I think one of the biggest things in wine is talking to people about it. And everyone in wine and this is something, sorry, I realise I'm rambling on with that question already, but this is something that I think people don't get when they're intimidated by wine, is that people who are in wine love to talk about it. So if you sit down at a restaurant and say to a sommelier, I'm having this dish, what do you think I should drink with it?
Do you not think it's more about the way that they talk about it? Because I think, look, it goes without saying, people that like wine like talking about it, but maybe there's a disconnect for those that are maybe earlier in their journey, feeling daunted by the way that we might talk about wine, especially like a sommelier. A sommelier could be very technical. They could get into elements that are just so far over your head that maybe feel intimidated by it.
Well, I think there are good sommeliers and there are bad sommeliers, like in any industry, in any job. And I think one of the skills that a sommelier has is to read the room and to read the table, to know who they're addressing. So whether they're they're serving someone who is really interested in the limestone chalky soil, or whether they've just been asked by someone, oh, I'm going to have the chicken, what would go best with that? They that's part of their job, is to read the room, who they're talking to, and balance that knowledge. I do agree with you very much about the language around wine, but I'm just saying, in the situation of sort of learning about wine and getting into wine, I think don't be put off by asking questions.
Yeah, and I think where I completely agree with you, and maybe is a little bit of a top tip for those that are more at beginner level, is when you go into a restaurant, what you sometimes forget is that is the sommelier's job. That's what they're paid to do. And sometimes you can feel intimidated. They come over, I'll give you the wine list. But actually asking those questions is around, is around their job, right? So it is I think it's a great piece of advice for people that is, use the tools that are in front of you. And if it's a sommelier and they're a good one, they're someone that can really, have a big impact and hopefully enable you to choose a great bottle. So I think that's a great piece of advice.
Yeah, and I think extending from that, I think maybe that as far as like the diners go, if they're there and they are feeling intimidated, it doesn't help but the fact that they don't then ask anything, because then the sommelier feels obliged to come over and ask them or introduce themselves to them, and then it's immediately that sort of weird situation where they're just sort of thinking they've just had to come and deal with the sommelier when maybe they didn't want to or whatever. But I think that's an interesting way to look at it, that sommeliers are actually really at the forefront of actually helping that whole situation, because when you go out for dinner and you order a wine, that's really when a lot of people will order wine, right? They may not necessarily just choose wine when they're out and about if they're drinking otherwise, but that's the real kind of touch point for people that are getting into wine, or so I think that's really interesting to think that.
And sometimes people think they're intimidating and they don't want to bother them.
Exactly.
They're so busy and important.
That's what I mean.
So we're just going to go for that one, and they don't actually know. Whereas what people need to realise is that, are you pouring a second glass already? We're like 2 minutes in.
Well,
Baller. Someone's not doing dry January. Wow. Okay. But yeah, I think that generally people go, they think that they're sort of being a problem or an issue, and in fact that is genuinely, as you've just said, the reason those people are there. They are there to help you.
Going back to so you said obviously that it didn't necessarily come from your parents. So I'm interested to know now, what does it look like when you do go back for a Sunday dinner? Is it you then now leading them into, are they more interested by everything now that you're so involved in wine, or are they just like, oh,
I think my parents are proud of me. I think I'll bring that's about it. I think I sort of take care of the wine. If I go back for Christmas, I'll do the wines. If I'm going back for lunch or dinner, I'll bring the wines, and I might chat a little bit about it. I would say max maybe 30 seconds. My father will often say, oh, that's really quite nice. Oh, I really like that. And then I'll say, oh, it's £80 a bottle, and he'll sort of spit it out, cough, and the idea of spending more than £10 a bottle of wine is still sort of horrific. Why would you? So, but they're also, although we love food at home, they're also not of the generation that go out and dine. We as a generation, I'm sort of lumping us all in the same generation here. Food and drink for us is an entertainment. We go out to dine and drink for fun, which I don't think previous generations did in the same way.
Not as much, yeah.
What do you think a reasonable amount of money is to spend on wine?
A reasonable amount of money totally depends what you're playing with. What's in your wallet?
No, but I mean in terms of your everyday enthusiast.
An everyday enthusiast. Okay, so
because it's from the perspective, like you said, your dad, like anything over £10 for him would be like aghast. But I think in like modern times, like in the context of wine as a product, like where do you and you must have a lot of experience going to a lot of tastings where you drink the range of wines.
Yeah.
Like, where do you think people should be?
Okay, so my sweet spot for wine, well, I probably spend a bit more than the average person, but my sweet spot is probably between 15 at the bottom then to like 35. And I know I'm getting some really good wine. I will say this, I do not want to shame anyone for what they can and cannot afford or what they do or do not like. I think that is boring and dull and not the point of a natural wine communicator. But I will say that knowledge is power and key. And I've had people say to me, "Oh, I wouldn't spend that on a bottle of wine because I'm not a wine snob." But they spend a couple of quid more on a fair trade coffee or a couple of quid more on fair trade chocolate.
Yeah.
But there isn't that understanding that wine is farmed.
Yeah.
There isn't understanding of the workers in the fields, the process, the time
Yeah.
it takes, the plants growing, all of that. And I think if you explain that to someone and go, but if you work backwards, that's tax, that's the bottle, what you're actually getting from the wine, you've got about a pound of, I think it's an average now, if you have a £9 bottle of wine, the actual what's left over once you tax is 50% of it, and then you take away the cost of the bottle and the packaging and the label, what you end up with is £1 to cover the actual wine and everyone's fees, everyone's salaries, all those workers in the field, all those winemakers. And when you put it like that, people reframe how they think of what they're buying. And I think that's quite important.
I think it's interesting to make that, that comparison to like coffees. I mean, coffee prices obviously with inflation have just gone up exponentially, and actually just people will just, without thinking, go and just continue to pay those prices for coffee if they're a coffee drinker, right? But I think part of the development of what you're saying around the education in wine is if you do start to appreciate it and start to then treat it as more of a research project, then you can actually find wines ahead of that curve that almost, they're obviously prices are affected by inflation, but less so in some ways than other more mainstream, consumable goods. So you're actually almost beginning to get into that world of like, oh, if I find this wine that is better value, then I'm almost drinking ahead of time, right? You're getting better value for, and also just going back to what you said about I wouldn't pay that for a wine. It's like, where's the inflection point? Is it like I own, like if it's suddenly £16, not 15, will I not drink that wine? And then it's kind of trying to work out from there, well, what is the driver? Is it simply just they just don't appreciate what they could allocate to wine versus other things? Or
but it's from a pure like mathematical economic perspective, it's the disproportional benefit you get from spending that extra £5, to your point, from going from that £9 bottle to 15, almost the entirety of that £6, apart from the slight increase on VAT, the almost entirety of that £6 is actually going on the wine. Yeah. So that £1 that was going to wine is now maybe 6 or 7. And that's actually a 600% increase in the quality you're now providing the winemaker to actually make a better wine. And so that's where I was asking the question a little bit earlier, just around sort of, I do think it's reasonable for people to maybe just spend that extra £5 to £10 versus that kind of base level. I think a lot of people do think £10 bottle of wine. I think, well, if you can just push yourself to 15 or 20, I can guarantee you your experience is going to change like significantly. And I think you'll find wines that suddenly you fall in love with, and you'll have experiences which will absolutely blow out the water what you were previously having. And I just think it's, especially in this day and age, you get an Uber in London these days, and even going around the corner costs 15, 20 quid, or you go to a pub and, pints these days are 6.50 to 8 quid just for one pint.
Yeah.
Oh, pints have gone up crazy, absolutely crazy. And your point about the coffee is a really good one. I'm not sure if you follow me on Instagram at Libby Brodie, but I did an Insta post about this recently where it is a real pet peeve where you easily spend £4.50, £5 without even thinking about it on your takeaway coffee in the morning. So many people standing at the station on my way in today holding their cups of £4.50 coffee. It's one little coffee and it's gone. Whereas a bottle of wine, you've got 5 glasses, maybe 6 glasses, maybe 3 given how you drink. And in this beautiful...
I just don't have the bowl to myself.
And it's taken months, years to create, and it's something to be shared and enjoyed over a whole meal, and people won't spend
You can't have it on a
double.
commute though.
That's true. That's a really good point.
And I'm not sure your bosses will be happy when you turn up the morning already having cracked open.
We can solve for that, I think. Like maybe a cult hat, with the beer hats you used to have with the straws. Yeah. Just with 2 bottles of wine in it.
Like a miniature.
That'd be good. Let's move slightly on to so a big thing of yours is around sort of wine and snobbery. And it carries that reputation, especially for women. What barriers do you think women face in the wine world, and how have you seen that change in recent years?
That's a big question. It's a big question.
Just thought we'd take it down a notch.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, so my column is called Wine Without Snobbery. Snobbery doesn't have to be gender focused. I would say that's sort of 2 different things to tackle in the wine world. But if we are talking about being a woman in the wine space, it's fascinating, particularly in what your region, really your area of wine, the fine wine world is a lot more male dominated. And when I started in wine, which really wasn't that long ago, a few years ago, I was often the only woman at the trade tastings or the press, or like maybe there'd be one other and you sort of nod to each other. And I was often on press trips being the only woman again. And that has totally changed. That is completely different now. There's often on press trips, I've been on press trips this man will remain nameless, but I went on a press trip, which was all women and one man.
Yeah.
And we're friendly, we're friends. And afterwards, he said, when we were getting the flight home, I found that quite awkward at times. You know, you ladies were talking about lady things, and he had, and I thought that was so fascinating to me, because I thought, well, yeah, I found things quite awkward sometimes when I went to press trips with all guys, and you guys were talking about actually quite often lady things, but and again in a slightly awkward way for me, and I think that shift has happened really quite quickly, and I credit part of that, and we can talk about this later, because I think it goes into also ethnicity and socioeconomic backgrounds and all of that. But with the pandemic, and also with the rise of these other platforms that people are using to access wine, and the rise of social media, where there's a lot more women creating content, I think, that I've seen than men. There are some fantastic men doing it as well. But the visuals of that, people learn in different ways, right? So some people want to read a book. Some people want to get a visual image. Some people listen to a podcast. People get their information in different ways. And I think social media content creation,
it's interesting you say that. I don't want to go off on a tangent, but I was having this conversation last week, because I was talking about Hailey Bieber's new cosmetic brand, Rude, which I think she sold for like 800 million, but valued her a billionaire. And you know, the conversation I was having was around cosmetic products and the proliferation recently, especially through social media, but a lot of female entrepreneurs being behind them. But then from the context of saying, like, okay, if you went back 20 years ago and said, right, name a female billionaire, it'd be very, very difficult to come up with names off the top of your head. But then even the ones you could name, like, let's say, you know, from the Walmart family, you know, it's generational wealth often, you know, a Heineken family, you know, you think of like the obvious female billionaires, they quite often be generational wealth. And now what I think is interesting with, and I don't know if this is connected to your point, but I think it's interesting in terms of the empowerment of women. I think social media, the ability for people to create these brands, these personal brands, to communicate with a huge audience, and to create, you know, Hailey Bieber in 3 years has created $1 billion company. Now, yes, she's a celebrity, but she basically did it all on her own. She created a brand, she had the distribution, and she had the ability to go out and create that wealth, to the point where she's now probably twice as wealthy as her husband, Justin Bieber, who, you know, has been, you know, quite a high profile person. But I think we're seeing this more and more, this empowerment and the ability, especially from a female perspective, which I didn't think existed before. I just don't think the tools were there. I don't think the platform and distribution was there to enable women to be able to have that position where they could create, you know, these brands without, you know, I don't know, I just feel like it's interesting.
I do think it's fascinating that when social media, I would say this in the wine world, because that's what's relevant to me, started taking off, and there were these various women taking pictures, images of themselves and the wine and events they went to and stuff, there was a lot of pushback from, I would say, the middle-aged men in wine. There was a lot of backchat about it, a lot of mockery around it. Oh, influencers, or I will go on this trip, but will there be any influencers there?
Right,
all of this sort of stuff. And I thought that was really interesting, because it's not doing anyone any harm.
Yeah.
Certainly not their careers. They're writing for Decanter, or they're already sorted. But this is a way that, as you have just pointed out, that women were able to be entrepreneurs and make a name for themselves and create income for themselves. And suddenly this platform, which was dominated by women in that way, was somehow very bad, very lowbrow. And yet their blogs seem to be highbrow, interesting. I feel there was a gender bias there. Even more interesting is that many of these chaps have now taken to Instagram and other social media platforms and are on it, because the world moves forward. We change.
Do you feel also you're communicating to the next generation, to a new generation as well? Like, would you say your target audience is those more established historical wine snobs, if we call them that? But let's say.
I mean, I hope that I have a broad appeal personally, because I will also say that a lot of people go to social media and go, "Oh, influencers, they know nothing." Loads of them are diploma grads. Loads of them have, you've got MWs on there, you've got diploma grads on there, you've got WSET, like qualified people in wine. And because they're attractive or taking photos or spending time on a reel, people assume they are less. And that is something, going back to your point, that I have definitely come up against. And I know lots of my colleagues, female colleagues, have come up against the sort of assumption. I was at a press trip recently. I'm going to tell you two stories, actually. One of them actually does beggar belief, but this one was a recent one, and was there with another female colleague about my age, and I think I was the only person who has a regular newspaper column on that trip, But she writes for 2 publications regularly as magazines. And this wine producer had done the whole tasting, and it was really good. It was a great tasting. It was a really fascinating producer, brilliant tasting. And he spent the whole time talking to the guys.
Right.
Really. And then as we left the tasting, he turned to me and my colleague and went, "So, do you girls have a blog or something?"
Huh.
And I went, "No, I'm here representing my newspaper, the most read business paper in London, and my colleague here writes for 2 magazines."
Yeah.
And he just went, "Oh. In fact,
Wow.
the guys had blogs, and nothing wrong with blogs, by the way. I'm just saying
Yeah.
it in comparison to how he meant." And the other thing that happened, which was truly
Was that how
mental,
recent was that?
That was, I don't want to out the press.
No,
trip,
but within the last
in
12 months?
2025. Yes.
Okay, fine, right, okay.
So then the other one that happened, which was mental, and I'm actually a great teachable moment for my male colleagues. I feel we were in Greece. I can out this one because it was a couple of years ago. In Greece, having a dinner. I'm the only woman at the table. There are other women on the press trip. You know this one. Only woman at the table. And we're all having dinner, talking to the winemakers. And the waiter comes around, and I notice that he pours all the men's wine from a decanter. And when he gets to me, he pours it from a bottle. And I went, sorry, excuse me. Can I just check? Am I having the same wine as everyone else? And the waiter looked at the winemaker, and the winemaker looked at the waiter, and they had this like back and forth discussion. And then the winemaker goes, "Well, you see, this is a very special wine."
No way.
Absolutely.
That's terrible.
Not for the women.
Oh my God.
And again, I think I was the only one there with a regular newspaper column, and I couldn't really believe it. And I said, "No, I would like to try the wine that everyone else is having." And it was interesting because I had 2 of my lovely male colleagues either side to me, and they were shocked because you don't see it. You don't, if it's not something that's being done to you necessarily, you wouldn't even notice. And it took me being vigilant to notice, because you're having a chat and then you suddenly notice this different pouring going on. And someone at the table did say, "Well, what's the big deal, Libby? You got the same wine in the end." I said, "Yes, but I had to notice. I had to be confident enough to raise it, question it, bring it up," which not everyone would be. I was like, "I think I'm doing a job equal to you guys."
Yeah.
And then I immediately am reminded that certain people around this table see me as second class. So that was that. I think these things
the
do
winemaker
happen.
particularly, yeah.
Well, these things do happen.
It's interesting, obviously, with wine as well, because I think, even over the last sort of 30 years, there has been some influential females in the wine world, especially when it comes to journalism. Jancis Robin's the obvious personally, but even someone like a Serena Sutcliffe, master of wine, but obviously, a massive part of the fine wine. It's just so shocking to hear, especially this, like now in this current
Right
time.
now,
It's like,
yeah.
it's unbelievable. But even... I know you're saying it, fine wine end of the market has been dominated, especially in consumer side, by males. But I do feel that historically wine has been maybe more open than other products to women. Maybe, I don't know, maybe I'm misspeaking.
But women drink
but,
it.
Yeah. But in terms of being influential, like Jancis Robinson has been a very influential voice
She's
in wine.
basically God
Yeah.
or goddess. Yeah.
Yeah.
You don't really get higher than Jancis. That's true. And there are so many.
But maybe the bar was just placed so high
Beckett,
for
Anne
people to get to
Kriebel,
that point.
I mean, there's so many women that I respect, admire, writers in wine, of previous generations, of current generations. Like, it's huge and it's massively changing. I'm just giving a couple of examples to show that these things still do happen. And if you think then, if you add in any ethnicity barriers, and I do think socioeconomic barriers as well, that may be less so. But I think, it can be a bit of a minefield. That's one of the main things we need to push in making wine accessible.
Yeah.
That it's not just, and I realize I'm saying this to 2 white men on this podcast, but it's not just the voices. It's not just that, because I think the food study, they did a survey, and I think 48% of women would prefer to drink wine, as opposed to, I think I'm fudging us here, but like 24% of men. And the point is, you've got this massive audience of women who do buy wine, who do drink wine, who do enjoy wine. So it just makes no sense that the people talking about wine come from this one tiny demographic. You need a whole spread. You need a whole spread, a whole range, a whole diversity to make the visibility of wine more important.
I think it's, I mean, frustratingly so, but I think it's one of those things. Wine is definitely in that category of, lots of other professions. I mean, across the last few centuries that have just inherently been dominated by men. I mean, we, a colleague of ours, of mine in America, Lorraine was, she often talked about how she got into wine, and she worked in banking, and the reason she got into wine was because she wanted to be able to actually hold her weight when sitting at a dinner table, and the wine list was passed around, and it was never given to her first, because it never was back then. And I just think that whole dynamic has been the case in so many of these, industries, which is it's just going to take time, right, to shift. But I think it's shifting far quicker now than it ever has done in wine, for sure.
Yeah. I mean, you guys must have noticed this in the people sort of investing in wine, going to auctions, buying wine. The age has gone down, from what I understand. You guys will know better than me.
Yeah.
And the people that you're seeing coming to your tastings, the people you see coming to auctions, that's changing as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think when we look at the male-female divide as well, the other thing for us that's interesting is just geographically how that changes. And I think in Europe, we're still very male-dominated when it comes to the fine wine market. But in places like Asia, I think we've always been probably 50-50, maybe even slightly more female-dominant. Especially places like Hong Kong and China, there's a lot of big female collectors, drinkers, especially influencers as well. So I don't know whether there's that Asian thing versus, kind of UK and Europe being a bit more traditional still to this day. But yeah, look, we are seeing a shift in terms of the age of people that are coming to buy and start collecting wines, and we're starting to see some of that shift in terms of the generation. I think the real problem for the fine wine market at the moment, and I was writing about this week, is we are starting to see, maybe some of those traditional collectors, sell off their collections. We're seeing kind of these big people going to auction now, either transferring it to the younger generation or just selling off their collections. And the question I have, and I suppose my only concern around the top end of the market is, are there enough new young collectors coming onto scene to take up all of that supply? And you look at the Bill Koch auction in the US and all the wines that he sold, into market, those wines need to be now filtering down into the kind of 30 and 40-year-old collectors who are starting their collection and going on that journey. And I just wonder whether there is a balance at the moment. It feels like maybe there's slightly too many of the older generation either maybe dying off, or the generational shift, or just selling off their collections because they've suddenly realized they've got 5,000 bottles of wine and never going to drink them. And so what else are they going to do with them?
I think it's that aspect is definitely something that I've been discussing more often recently, which is, we talk a lot about the younger generations not drinking as much, not just wine, but across the board. But I think equally there's such a bigger focus now in the media, in general society, around health and longevity. And I think you're actually seeing as much of that elder generation actually almost being forced out of alcohol, wine, for their health benefit. To Tom's point, is it then going to be a struggle for those very top end wines to pick up market elsewhere? I guess the one benefit in some ways is that obviously the market has corrected, so they're not as expensive as they were 3 years ago. But certainly there's a big void there if that does continue in that fashion.
But you are seeing that trend around the health side of things. Like I saw someone this morning who was saying, "Oh, my wife's pretty much like given up drinking alcohol." So he was like, "Oh, I've got to drink on my own now." And but the reality is, like, you're just not going to drink as much, right? And he's not just going to open a bottle of wine on his own and drink it, especially if his wife's now not drinking. And I remember seeing another big collector from the Middle East for lunch a few months ago, and he was saying, "Oh, the biggest problem I've got now is like my friendship group where we'd meet up maybe once a month and all bring bottles. Like 2-3 of these guys are now not drinking anymore. So then like the group's dwindling, and people don't want to open a whole bottle of wine at lunch." And he was just saying like my opportunities to drink are becoming more limited. So he was like, I'm just at a point now where I'm not really adding anything to my collection anymore because I just don't think I'm ever going to get around to drinking it. So it's interesting to see how that health element of wine is starting to impact people's buying patterns. And
don't you think there'll be a pendulum swing? I mean, I know there's this whole health thing around alcohol consumption, and obviously, it is a toxin. So, I totally get it to an extent.
Yeah.
I do personally feel that wine is slightly different to various spirits and beers and stuff. But I think what we also have to acknowledge here are the benefits of wine. And I think that people, when they're talking about well-being, there is this sort of Spartan-esque, you can't do anything. No refined sugar, no alcohol. And
social media is making that worse.
And
right?
that's the few, absolutely. And that's the few, but that's not sustainable. No. I think most people want to know how to make a more moderate lifestyle. And if you look at the blue zones, where people have the healthiest lifestyles, the most longevity.
Yeah, wine's a big part of that.
Wine is...
So what's a blue zone?
There are these areas of the world, regions of the world that they have studied. Right. And these are regions where the population... they live the longest and they live the healthiest, and they analyze
often
everything.
Mountainous, aren't they?
And it's all about exercise and
what
produce.
Have you got on a location as an example?
Well, I think like large parts of Italy.
Right.
But you can
higher reaches in China and stuff like that.
But in most of these areas, wine is an an almost daily thing. Now it's not a lot. It's 1 or 2 glasses a day. It's not.
So I've blown it already.
Yeah, you're this is it. It's not even lunchtime and you're done. But actually, so wine in itself is not the enemy. People have been drinking this for centuries. It's a huge part of we are actually biologically evolved to break down alcohol. We've done that since we were apes. So I think that our bodies are fine with alcohol to a certain degree. And actually, it's beneficial for us. Dr. Laura Catena does a lot of work on this. Obviously, she's a wine producer and she's also a doctor. And she's fascinated by how this works. You should definitely look up everything she's written on it. Because she's saying it sort of depends, which of course makes perfect sense, on your individual body. So
and what you're doing like day to day. If you're a sedentary job, 9 to 5, Monday, Friday.
So if you have, so there are links that people have said there are links to breast cancer and wine. However, there's a opposing link to cardio issues and wine. Actually, it's good for that. So depending on your family makeup, you can sort of decide what works for you. And also, I think with people are talking about their health and well-being, I love that. I did that in quotation marks. Well-being. What? No, I'm very big on well-being. But it's the idea of if alcohol is bad for you, if you get crackingly bad hangovers, you black out, you're vomiting. If your body does not like alcohol, then avoid it just like people avoid gluten or dairy if you're lactose intolerant. Your body might not be good with alcohol, but most people's are.
Yeah.
Don't
make us do it as well.
Don't. And I do think the younger generation has been this huge furore in the news about Gen Z, Gen Z not drinking and everything.
Yeah.
I think they are drinking. They're not drinking as much wine.
Yeah.
They're really into their craft gins and beers and stuff like that. They might be drinking less in a way that they don't open 2-3 bottles at lunch maybe, but they are still drinking. And also, why are we obsessed with them? I'm sorry, but has that age group ever been the ones like funding wine? No, like
exactly.
when we're not Gen Z.
That's a great point.
But like when I was 23, I wasn't going, you know what I want to invest in? White Burgundy. I was like, that's not what I was.
It would have been a smart move.
It would have been really, I wish I had been thinking like that, but I was still kind of on the cusp of the Smirnoff Ice years. So what I think.
You can't torpedo White Burgundy, can you?
No. Or you can, have you?
You can. I'm just saying you can.
It's possible. But I think that we need to stop this obsession with them because they're not the people doing it anyway. It's our generation.
It's Gen Beta now.
It's the people you need to have some money to be able to invest or collect wine because that's just, you have to. So you need to have enough of an income to be able to do that. And that does definitely price certain ages or careers out of it. But that's about it.
I think everything sorry, you go, Tom.
No, just because it's tying in the health and the generational thing. I think the only thing that's maybe slightly different this time around is I do feel like that, if you think about the cultural reference points that we had as millennials growing up, there was a lot of cultural reference point that was kind of grounded in alcohol consumption.
Fab went in deep for me.
But but if you think about now, especially with like the tech. I want to use this broad term, like tech bros being very influential in terms of people who people look up to, especially the new generation. You've got people like Brian Johnson, who's now like this fixated on longevity and like doing everything in his power to understand every single aspect of his body and how to live to 150. Now, to your point, like that's a very extreme way of living. And if you look at alcohol in that regard, look, I'll be honest with you. If you looked at it in that regard, fundamentally, you are going to realize that alcohol probably has a detrimental impact on your body. If you look at it like a molecular level, I can't see how wine at a molecular level has a benefit or alcohol has a benefit to your body. But you're forgetting about all those other elements, like the cultural elements, the social elements, psychological elements, the relaxation elements.
It thins your blood.
But think about
heart issues.
But think about all the friendships you've created over the years, like those moments where you create those friendships. You met someone for the first time, and how it's a lubricant to social experience.
Is it a coincidence that we're having a single epidemic at the time that wine is plummeting? I think there's a link there. Everyone's single. Oh, the male loneliness epidemic. Oh, everyone's single.
No, that's the divorce issue.
It's the fact. No, it's the fact that we're not drinking enough. No, that's how people meet.
Yeah.
But no, I think it's very important socially. I feel like we've gone slightly off topic. We've gone down a number of segues during this. But I think that I actually have a fascinating story about the tech bros, but it's not pro wine, so I feel like maybe I shouldn't say it. But it's not it. The tech bro basically met a tech bro at a City A.M event, and he's from England or Anyway, he went to LA, was moved there, Silicon Valley, proper in that like Elon Musk heartland sort of stuff. And he came to a party and he brought a bottle of wine.
Yeah.
And they were disgusted by him. And they were like, how could you bring that? How could you drink that? Do you know how bad that is for you?
When he was in San Francisco, he took wine to a party.
He took, yeah. Right. But on the table, they had laid out drugs. Like all the pills and the powders were out there for the dinner party. But they saw that as efficient. Like you take a pill and you get high, you take this and you get buzzed.
Yeah.
But there was no pleasure. And I said, that's fascinating. So they've just missed the point of wine then, which isn't to get buzzed. Yeah. That happens. But actually,
an over-analytical approach to...
It's pleasure.
Yeah.
So all this like tech bros and health and longevity, you're missing the point of life. Life is about pleasure, community, enjoyment. I mean, it's about food, drink, and people. That's since pre-biblical times we've done that. We come together around a table. But there was an
interview with Mark Zuckerberg, and he said he hasn't even had a cup of coffee ever in his life.
I just feel sorry for him.
But so my point is, like, if you think about a new generation, like these people are put on pedestals, and you see them as like being the most uber, successful people in the world, the people to look up to. And they have this way of life and this way of talking about life, whether it's that approach that you just talked about, or whether it's the extreme Brian Johnson approach.
Yeah, like
I'm
getting
just saying,
up
like
at 4 a.m.
when we were growing up, our generation, like all of our reference points, whether it's good or bad, were probably more on the hedonistic lifestyle element of.
And wasn't it fun?
Yeah,
like the 90s and like the early 2000s. Like it wasn't really about being. Yeah. Do you know what I mean?
I have very few good memories of a
page
jog.
on Instagram around Paul Danan, for example. Why did that become so popular? It was, and all the stories he makes up on that page, they're funny because they're reference points to that cultural shift, that movement. But if you relay that into the future for the next gen, what's their version of that going to be? Oh, it's going to be like Mark Zuckerberg talking to Jensen Huang around like having some sort of zero alcohol product and whatever. I don't know. It just feels like there's a disconnect there between what we had and what they're experiencing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. But I'm so in agreement with you, Libby, around I just think it is moment in time. I think firstly everything we've said around social media, how quickly trends can come in and out of fashion, right? And that's been accelerated massively. So I think it won't take too long, I think, before I think of all the alcohol products, wine is probably the one that has the most elements that are interesting beyond the wine itself, beyond the drink, if that makes sense. Like maybe a few spirits, whiskey maybe, but I think it will just take time for that to come back round and probably become a byproduct of this new wave of longevity and things like that, to your point.
But we're also seeing sort of an increase in certain wines, right? So sparkling wine consumption's up in general. People are... So yes, there is the well-being thing, but I think there is an increased and sustained interest in champagne, but also in other sparkling wines as well. And I think that's continuing for a number of reasons. I think firstly, and possibly, it is also the Instagram effect, because the pop of a bottle, the look of the sparkling wine, there is something very attractive visually, audio of a bottle of sparkling wine, but also they're lighter. They're generally lighter in alcohol than still wines. And I think that sort of if we focus on the trends of lower in alcohol, more celebration, it looking good, sparkling wine is here to stay. It's going to keep going.
Can I just ask you a couple of questions around like your work? So obviously as a columnist at City A.M. and obviously on social media, content for you, like you must have a round the clock pressure to be producing content. Is that fair to say?
I can sometimes feel a bit like a monster that needs feeding to keep up your own relevance, but I love a story. Yeah. I mean, if you look at my previous career in theatre...
Does it come natural to you to be able to just constantly like be coming up with would you describe us as a naturally very creative person that...
Ooh, I'm not sure about that. I'm not sure if I'm creative, but I definitely love communication and a story and to tell a story. When I was in my theatre, which is my main career, I was a producer. So that's backstage. That's not on stage. That's like the business part. I'm the business part of showbiz. So I did all the contracts but what I did love was creating a story and getting an audience on board. And I think that that's served me quite well in the wine world because I can attract an audience. I can communicate a story. I can get key messages across, hopefully in an engaging way. So is it too much pressure? No, that's a bit like someone saying, oh, now you're in wine. Do you ever not want to drink wine? And you're like, no.
But I'd imagine like once, especially when you go on like a journey with social media, you start it, you get followers, you then start getting sort of engagement. There's a pressure to increase, like, you got to keep that momentum going, you got to keep delivering for your audience, and that almost creates its own level of
Stress
and pressure.
I don't
don't
know. The beauty of social media is that it's your own page, so you can kind of do it on your own, off your own bat,
Yeah.
and when you're ready and when you want to. And just when people get upset about following someone, just unfollow them. It's a bit like having a magazine to hand. You've got advertorial, you've got editorial, you've got beautiful images, you've got interesting captions, you've got some education in there. Like, I think people get too worried about all of this
You
stuff.
try and stay led by the story as opposed to like, for instance, start of year, New Year's resolutions. I don't know if you do them, but
I do goals.
okay, yeah, goals. So within your framework of what you do you then have goals for the year where you think, okay, I want to try and tackle this as a theme, and therefore you're looking for stories around that, or do you just let the stories come and then work with them as you
I'm
see
probably a bit more whimsical.
So there's
I
the
sort of just
latter.
do. Yeah, I think I sort of fly by the seat of my pants a bit in life. So something will come in, I go, God, that's interesting.
Yeah.
I'll put something on about that, or I think I used to be a planner, and then life got too busy, and then I
Right.
just went, oh, sod it, I'll just do what comes in when it does. And what I find particularly interesting, and what's great with your social media as opposed to when you're writing for a newspaper or you've got a commission from an editor, is it could be entirely personal.
Yeah.
So I can say, I love this, or I hate this. Now, you might sometimes stir people up. I've definitely written things as well that people haven't always enjoyed, but it's personal pieces, and that's and I think it's all very subjective, isn't it? Wine is subjective. I think that's how wine is changing, and obviously with your platforms you're making it far more democratic as a thing, which is so useful, because I think that many people have, we in our generation, when we were growing up, you had the experts, and they would go, this is 94 points. What does that mean? It means that one person really liked it. But I mean, what is the personal relevance? I think what we're noticing now from people purchasing wine and learning about wine is that they're far more interested in how they can personally engage with it. How, they want to know the background story. They want to know the people who created it, why they created it. Like, want to know more about the wine itself, and then they want to be able to make their own decisions and choices.
Yeah.
And I think give them the information. People aren't stupid, and I think a lot of wine communication historically has sort of thought people are stupid. I'm the expert.
Yeah.
You don't know what you're talking about, and it's this many points, and this is what I say. I think now we are embracing a way of communicating about wine, which is people aren't stupid. Let's give them some knowledge. Let's give them information, and then they can decide if they want to buy it, if they want to drink it, if they don't.
Yeah, I think obviously social media is quite an aspirational thing for a lot of people. Maybe the last question for you on this is there like a secret to your success in terms of how you've built up your audience and your kind of following, do you think?
I am very persistent. No, I think I get on with people.
Yeah.
I like people. Like, I like meeting people. I like having a drink with people. So most people I connect with on social media is because it's social.
Yeah.
It's social media. When I first got onto Instagram, wine Instagram, I started on my actual family like Instagram, and then people were going, why are you posting these pictures of bottles? It's really boring. So I started a wine Instagram so I could take my hobby over there. And then you start chatting to people. I've got some of my very best friends in the world I met through wine, and we go on press trips together or trips together, and we drink wine together. And I think part of the fact that my career did have a very steep, very fortunate trajectory is I genuinely know how to tell a story, hopefully, and I genuinely like people and want to connect with them. And if you give me a job, I'll get it. I used to be a producer, so I'll get it to deadline and under budget. But so that's sort of, I think it's that kind of, just go for it. Just go for it, say yes and do it. And I also have a very low embarrassment threshold. So
I was going to say the cringe factor is quite a,
I
a lot of people just never get there because they're just like, I don't want to ever put myself out there.
Oh no, I've regularly embarrassed myself loads. Spitting at events, disaster. So I regularly sort of embarrassed myself in multitudes of ways. And I think you just go, it's life. I'm a real person. Let's just crack on.
I think I heard someone say on Instagram or on social media, they were like, success on social media is just on the other side of cringe.
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably pretty cringe. Depends on what your cringe level is. I know one of my friends, Hannah, is like, oh, but it's just me. I'm just being me. So just to move on to a podcast I recorded last week, we looked at the fine wine market in 2025. Mm-hmm. So we did our kind of, top wines of 2025. We looked at, what the trends were in the market. For those of you that are interested in that show, there's a separate podcast on that and a report coming out. So make sure you listen along and download that report. But yeah, there's some interesting data that came out of there. Do you want to hazard a guess, or do you know the answers to this question? Do you want to hazard a guess on the top 3 most traded wines of 2025?
Dom Perignon was in there. Senya,
not in the top 3, but it was in the top 10.
Top 10.
A really interesting one for me, just
Calm
because
Sauvignon?
Calm Sauvignon was
22?
in the top 10, not
Yeah.
top 3. Rioja Alta.
Uh,
Rioja Alta Grand Reserva 2011. Second most traded wine in the market last year, which I thought was really interesting.
And do you have any knowledge of why that would be? Like, what's brought that to the fore?
I think Rioja,
value for money?
just like collectors, drinkers, consumers, they love it. They love Rioja. They love the big names in Rioja. 1, because the value's great. 2, because there's volume. And 3, because generally speaking, the way that obviously Rioja's aged, a lot of the Rioja that comes onto the market is ready to be consumed, right? So, again, looking at that particular example, it's a 2011 vintage. So if you just think yourself in the broad spectrum of fine wine, it has to be one of, the best value wines you can buy out there, whether you want to put it into your cellar and drink it in a few years' time because it's going to age, or whether you just want to crack it open and have a good example of a mature bottle at the dinner table. And it's not going to break the bank. You're talking probably in the region of £250 for a case of 6 in bond. Okay, higher than what we were talking about in terms of what's a reasonable price to spend on wine. But, I think it's so accessible to everyone. And again, I just think there's a level of consistency, especially around Spanish wines. And I find it in Vega Sicilia. And I know we're going to a different end of the spectrum. And Vega Sicilia always comes up as one of the most traded wines in the market.
And Valbuena.
I have never, ever opened a bottle of Vega Sicilia in any scenario, whether it's with complete beginners, experts, experienced people in different countries, and people haven't either rated it the wine of the night or top 1, 2, or 3.
Oh, it's brilliant.
And again, I don't know whether it's the approach of winemaking, especially with the longer aging and the style, but they're just crowd pleasers. People understand, and they haven't got this level of complexity that maybe Burgundy and Pinot Noir has for a beginner, where they're sitting there going, I can't believe this is £500 a bottle. I don't get it. And I think with Rioja, it doesn't try and show itself as being something that's super complex in terms of oh, you're an idiot if you don't understand why this wine's good.
So do you think people are doing this they're trading this because they're going to drink it themselves, or do you think people are seeing it as an investment that they're just going to keep in bond forever?
Yeah, look, I think when we look at a secondary market trading, obviously you have different participants who are buying, right? Is people buying just immediately to drink? It's people that are buying to put in their home cellar or in a bond, and it's people that are looking to trade to invest and make money. In a weird way, I think at that lower price point, it does become more difficult to actually make money from investment, just because of the cost of carry from storage and insurance is going to eat into any profits at say £250 per bottle. If you're spending £15 on storage per year, that's effectively 5% of the total cost. So I don't see it as a massively great speculative investment asset. But at the same time, if I'm a collector and I'm starting on my journey, I can safely put that into my collection, whether it's in bond or at home, draw down on it over the next 5-10 years, but also know that at any point in time, if my tastes change or I get a divorce and I need to sell off my wine collection, it's a wine that's easily tradable. So it kind of has a lot of elements. And I always think about this aspect of like optionality. Yeah. And I think optionality when it comes to people that collect wine or buy wine not for immediate consumption, I think sometimes it's around optionality. You want to buy wines that excite you, that interest you, that when the time is right, you go to drink it, you're going to enjoy it. But also at the same time, if at some point in the future your circumstance change or your taste change, you can resell it easily.
Yeah.
And I think that optionality comes in bucket loads when you buy something like Rioja Alta without the pressure of the price tag, right? Because if you try and translate that into Bordeaux and suddenly you're spending 5 times as much, so let's say £1,000 on a second growth wine from a good vintage of a decent amount of age, there's a bit more pressure then in terms of like, is this a good decision? Should I be buying this wine? Am I actually going to drink it? If I need to resell it, can I resell it? With something like a Rioja Alta at 250, you're getting 96 plus point wine, maturity, ageability, and liquidity. And I think it's almost like the perfect combination.
Yeah.
So,
I was going to say, I think Rioja as well, if we, you made jokes about Pinot Grigio. I think it's one of those...
Off there, I think. Well,
I think it...
Off air.
We'll come on to that. That was in the outtakes. But I think Rioja is one of those wine that I think at all levels, Rioja is quite a familiar wine to people. So therefore, as a result of that, there's enough good Rioja at the more affordable price points that we talk about for people to feel that familiarity when they then jump into something like a Rioja Alta, whatever it is. I think there's much more polarization, like you said, in Pinot Noir in different regions, where that immediate kind of feeling of I have no idea what's going on here with this wine at that price point. I think that helps Rioja. And then I think on the other side of things, I was going to say anecdotally, I've noticed a lot more conversations that I'm having with collectors, investors, and a lot more of the people coming to us or to the market at the moment are having that hat on that you said, where it's like a little bit of, I want to cover both bases. I want to be familiar with the wines I'm investing in. I want to know that even if my situation changed, or if I just wanted to drink them, I like them, I know them. I think that pure investment focus on at least people that I've been speaking to has been less obvious in the last few sort of maybe 6-12 months. I think people are now looking at it going, I want to have a collection. I want it to improve in value, but I also want to be able to maybe lean into it for drinking as much as I do potentially need to sell it if situation changes. So I think that's an interesting point.
I mean, I find that very reassuring, to be honest, because I think that wine, you know, it's farmed. These winemakers toil for ages, you know, to make this product, and they want it to be enjoyed. When you speak to winemakers and you go, how do you want people to think about your wine? They're like, I want it to be enjoyed around a table with people. I don't think the idea that it's always kept forever and ever and ever, traded and never actually enjoyed. I love the fact that people are collecting and investing in wines that they actually want to drink, maybe as well. So maybe you get 2 cases, and one you keep there and one you have to drink, and you see how it develops over time. And I think that's one of the basics when you're starting a collection, because I speak to a lot of people who want to sort of start collecting their wine. And I sort of say, you buy a few so you can try one now, try one in a few years, but it is about that enjoyment and that pleasure. And I think that's probably why regions that people enjoy drinking do quite well on the investment collection, because as you say, it's what people know. And that's why education is so important. That's why going
Massively
to tastings
so,
is so important.
I think the only friction point from a winemaker perspective is, you know, I absolutely want all of your wines you ever produce to be consumed. But the other friction that exists is, you know, the economic friction, which is, you know, these guys do need to make the wine. They do need to release it. They can't keep it in their cellars because their cellars aren't big enough, and they've got the next vintage coming along. And look, most of the top winemakers in the world are making wines to be consumed in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. They're not immediately ready to be drunk. And so there is a friction point, right? Because they need to move it out of their cellars. They need to generate economic value from it. But at the same time, they've made a product that isn't ready to be drunk straight away.
But they want it to be drunk eventually.
No, 100%. But what I'm saying is the friction point in the middle is who is responsible now for being the custodian of that wine. And so I think that what I've always believed in is I believe in this education around there isn't such a thing as collection or investment or drinking. It's all one thing. And what that one thing is, that whether you're a collector, you see yourself as a collector, or someone who's going to consume wine in the end, or someone who wants to retain the economic interest, those things are aligned. Then they're not misaligned, because whether I resell in 10 years time, I'm going to resell that wine better in 10 years time if it's perfect provenance, it's been stored correctly, whether in your house or whether in a professional storage facility, and you're a custodian for that wine for the next generation. But what I will do to protect it, the economic interest, is the same thing I'll do to protect the quality of the wine. So if I then open it in 10 years time, I'm going to be doing the same things. The same behaviors are going to drive me to protect that wine, so when I drink it, it's the best possible expression of itself. And I think for me, it's a little bit of a trade-off. And I think there is some, from an economic perspective, there is some value that someone should derive for being a custodian. I don't think it should be egregious. And that's where the speculation comes into it, which is different, right? William Kelly releases his wines, people snap them all up, they take them off the market, and suddenly you've got to pay $2,000 for a bottle of Bourgogne Aligote. Now that's speculation, that's demand supply coming very, very extreme. But look, I think if you have a new release of Bordeaux, or a new release of, you know, most Burgundy wines or Italian wines, etc., if they need to be aged for the next 10, 15 years, I think the custodian of that wine should either be protecting it and having that cost of carry so they can enjoy it in the future themselves. But if they don't enjoy it and they resell it to someone else to enjoy, whether it's a restaurant, a hotel, or another private individual, they should get some benefit from it. And the benefit will be the appreciation of the value of that wine.
I completely agree with what you're saying. And I think that is partly what makes wine such a special thing to collect and invest in, because it is a limited product, which is why people buy it. There is the law of, you combine that with the law of supply and demand. It is something of the moment, and that's obviously very attractive, as you say, in whenever it comes into its own in 10 years or whatever, and that's brilliant. They can either drink it or they can sell it, and that's wonderful. They have the freedom to do that. So no, I do agree with you that there is that sort of supply and demand issue. It makes me a little bit ick, that's a technical term, when people, as you say, bulk buy stuff and then to drive the prices up and all of that, and it keeps it from the people who actually might really love that wine. But that's an emotive point rather than a practical one.
And it's a certain tier of wine as well that you're talking about. And I think also, to Tom's point, I think that if it's managed in the right way, it can become a massive tool for the wine, for the brand, for their abilities to continue to make great wine, right? I think I think what's also in equal measure, you'd imagine that most winemakers, if the wine is being drunk too young, they would equally be like, I'm not, as much as they don't want the wine to never be drunk, they also don't want it to be drunk not in its prime window, right?
Correct.
So because that will, in a new market, that could immediately impact how well that's taken up, because you see that an awful lot when I was in the US, whereby the vintages available in merchants, in wine shops, they weren't really the right vintages, but just because distribution wouldn't allow for it. So people will then have a massive misconception of a certain producer region immediately because they're just not able to access the right stuff. So I think that's just one of a few things that is definitely, it needs to be maybe managed better than it is. But I do think there's a world where it has to exist, like Tom said, because if you're saying that wine's not going to be consumed for 10 years anyway, until its optimum, it needs to be stored in the right place.
Yeah.
But the other thing is, it's interesting, is like in the last maybe sort of 20 years, when wine's become more of a financial asset or something that has become so valuable that you want to protect at all costs, I think it's going to result in the future generations, us being able to drink back vintages of stuff that you can't really do today. Like even you go back to like 80s and 70s Burgundy, the amount of times you open bottles and like they haven't been stored well, or you can't trace it. You open the bottle and you're just like, hang on, this is an 85 Burgundy. And it just doesn't taste right. It doesn't feel right. Where's this been? How's someone looked after it? I just don't think that infrastructure was in place for such a large period of time. So I think us looking back now into those periods of time, it's very rare that you get to try perfect examples of those wines. Whereas I think in the future, we'll have the opposite effects. And I think what we do on our side of business, and I know something that Jay works with quite extensively, is we look at like this ecosystem, this life cycle, where it's kind of, let's say a new release from, Gaia, for example, like the Barbaresco, right, the new vintage, and no one's really buying that to drink right now. But let's say collectors have it in their portfolios. We then partner with, the entree, for example, so like Michelin star restaurants, big restaurant groups, who effectively look at us as like almost like a secondary sort of inventory that they can draw down on. So we'll have like Michelin star restaurants that are looking through and going, oh, this is stuff that we want to draw down and have in our restaurants. And that's, for me, that's kind of like the perfect life cycle, which is we're almost leveraging the economic value in wine appreciating as a way to get investment capital to store and preserve these wines. So then when they do go to the Michelin star restaurants, the consumers in those restaurants are then getting the best examples of those bottles. And I think, again, that's another way for a winemaker or wineries to look at it, which is not necessarily as like an evil if their wines aren't immediately drunk, but looking at it as actually a useful utility that exists within the market to make sure that their bottles end up on the right tables in the best condition possible.
Yeah, it goes back to that point we made around the sommeliers. I think every part of the chain in fine wine in particular needs to be aware of what that represents. Tom, give us a bit of a rundown on what we've got here.
I mean, it's it's a village level Maurice Saint-Denis from Domaine Arlo. I think it was picked based mostly on the vintage, but obviously it's a great producer and it's a great example of village level Burgundy drinking really well. But it's just me more 2017 vintage. I think I was having this conversation a couple of days ago. Drinking really well up and down the scale, Village, Premier, especially some of the Grand Cru 17s are just absolutely phenomenal. And I think it's one of those vintages that got kind of slightly overlooked because you had the ripe at 18, 19. Obviously, before that, you had 15 and 16. So I think if you talk to collectors, people maybe overlook the 17 vintage.
I think also,
but I think it's a little bit of an earlier drinking vintage. So actually the wine's a little bit more approachable. I think it recently, having tried even like 2010 Burgundy, you still feel like they need to be left alone for a bit. So I think if you look at the most recent vintages of Burgundy, 17 has been overlooked, a bit of an off-prime vintage. So I think prices aren't as high as other years, so actually getting a better deal, but drinking really well. And they've got a nice balance of the acidity and freshness that comes from a slightly cooler vintage, but I think it's got that approachability. It still has nice levels of fruit on it. And I think all up and down the Côte de Nuit, everything's showing really well from Chambord Musigny, Maurice Saint-Denis up to Gevrey Chambertin. From examples I've had recently have done really well. But this is obviously Domaine Arlo's Maurice Saint-Denis, which, I think it's drinking really well in terms of its price point, around sort of £55-60 per bottle. So, Going up
nice
the
my dad would be gobsmacked.
What do you think?
I think it's really beautiful. I think it's really light, really fresh. And it's interesting you said that, because I was thinking, 2017, I don't really write or see a lot of that vintage. I get quite excited about 2018, 2015, but this is very light, very fresh. Pinot Noirs tend to have for me like this sort of, you get your own tasting notes in your head, right? You get your own sort of thing. So I'm sort of like, I get this sort of dried rose petals in a wooden box kind of note for me, sort of is it. But this is actually really It's light. It's got, as you say, that lovely like fine fruit there, but it's got those edges of the savoury into it as well. And yeah, I think it's very nice.
Yeah, I think it finishes like for good or for bad. I've kind of fallen into this trap of really liking high acidity wines, whether it's white or red, and I do struggle sometimes with the really ripe vintages, not just from Burgundy but other regions when you haven't maybe the acidity is a little bit lacking. I always need that acidity, that persistence, that backbone, because I feel like that's the kind of like the spine that holds a wine together. So again, that's why I like 17, because I think in lean vintages that aren't ripe enough, you get too much acidity, too much tannins, and you don't get enough fruit, and that's obviously when it can go the wrong side. But I do think you said it's quite light. It feels light. It's kind of balanced. It has a nice perfume to it, aromatics, but it has got that core of acidity, which is kind of where you finish. So that's
and it is just slightly saline almost. Is the lasting taste I get, which I think is nice to have. Almost meaty.
It has got I think that sort of savoury note towards the end, but very light, very fresh, and very on trend right now. Lighter, fresher wines. Yeah, everyone wants them.
Yeah, good way to ease into moist January for sure.
Just ease into something moist.
Yeah, exactly. I'm going back to the 17 vintage. I think it's interesting because I do think sometimes it's challenging for the wider market for such a panning of the Bordeaux 17, not a great vintage. Upon release, not
every vintage has its day though.
Has its day. And this is what I was going to say, but I think sometimes in France, in particular Bordeaux, Burgundy, I think given that they're so different, obviously all vintages are very different, but I think generally people will lean towards vintages that are across both good, generally good, like the 18's good across both, versus 17. I think sometimes that's a good way to approach Burgundy is look for those vintages where Bordeaux's been panned, like 13, another example. But actually, I was just going to say Bordeaux 17's drinking really well, really affordable as well. We've got quite a few in the wine fridge office, and they're also in a really decent little spot.
Yeah.
So have we got time for a quick touch on Burgundy 20? New vintage. Obviously, I was going to say it sounds like it's going to be another challenging release.
Just the quantities are tiny, right?
Quantities are tiny, and I think
decimated.
It kind of leans into just this element where I just think for Burgundy this side of Christmas, it's about just trying to backfill where you can't find obviously new access to the new release. I think there's going to be a lot of eyes on the 18s, the 20s, the 21s. I think just as a sort of snippet, I think for people looking to get into Burgundy new release, I think it's probably going to be one where you're going to struggle to get as much as you might like.
Obviously Burgundy is one of those areas that's really, and it's in a rock and a hard place because obviously the inflationary period it's gone through just purely from demand and how many people want to buy and collect Burgundy, far outstrips supply. But then at the same time, if you look at recent vintages, how many vintages have been absolutely decimated by different sort of climatic conditions, whether it's the white side. Obviously this year in 24 it's mostly the red wines that have been affected and the production levels are absolutely minuscule. So you kind of go from one year to the next hoping there's going to be more allocations, more supply, and there's another challenge for the winemakers to deal with, which is impacting the supply side. I think 25 is back to normal yield, so that's a good thing to know that that's coming along and that's at the cellars.
I've heard that 24 is actually a really gorgeous vintage, limited in supply, but a very classic, fresh vintage in itself.
Yeah. Of the berries that survived, they were of optimal quality.
Exactly. They did it for those that were failed. So if looking at Burgundy, then I think, and that was one other thing I wanted to maybe finish on was just around your report, which I was obviously reading the last iterations of edit for. The market itself has in last year was kind of a two-folded side of the market, and I thought it was really interesting going back to what you're saying about older vintages. To see how many of those prime vintages, like 96s, 98s, 2000, like vintages that maybe needed that time to be able to reach their windows. I think now to see lots of those wines and examples of wines that have produced good return in the last year, it's kind of playing into that kind of scarcity aspect, but also the fact that they are, fantastic vintages of Bordeaux in particular. I'm just thinking off the top of my head is that I think it's come around to a real kind of moment in the sun for like good prime vintages of Bordeaux because prices have come off and because access has kind of opened up a little bit where people are opening up their cellars. That would be a certainly, I would suggest anyway, a great place for buyers to be looking is like older vintages of Bordeaux. to pick up good deals while they exist currently.
Yeah, I think the headline is that the wine market's dropped sort of 30% from the peak, but we're seeing a slowdown of it. Sort of 23, 24, 25, kind of 10% depreciation, 8%. Now we're looking at sort of around 6%. But in the last quarter of the year, actually prices started to come up, activity started to pick up a little bit. One swallow doesn't make a summer, so it's very much to wait and see how much of the market recovery will start filtering through to a broader spectrum of wines. But I think where we saw the last quarter of the year, it was kind of the most liquid wines, the obvious blue chip names that have kind of benefited the most. It's kind of like they're almost like the bellwether of the wine market. When things start picking up, they're the things that will start you will noticeably see happen quickly. So Sassicaia, for example, a super Tuscan wine, immediately, we're seeing multiple vintages trade up. Opus 1's been trading up. Salon 2002, 1997 has been trading up. But I think to your point, Jay, what's interesting is I think after the last 2 or 3 years where prices have come down, I think, you are seeing people look for like that level of maturity where it actually looks quite good value, sort of 90s Bordeaux, early 2000s, things that have got now sort of 15 to 20 years of bottle age on it. Mm-hmm. And actually after kind of the period we've just gone through, coming out at kind of quite more accessible prices from a collectible perspective. And we've definitely seen that in the trends in terms of the types of wines that are starting to pick up attention and demand in the market. And
they're now in their window as well, right?
Yeah.
So it's like you're not having to speculate at those levels before. Yeah. You're saying actually just buy now and drink. That's kind of the, if you can afford to, with some of those back vintages. One final closing question I have for you, Libby, which is if wine and wine investment are to truly democratize, what still needs to change?
More grassroots level everyday education, more normalizing of wine. Wines are in supermarkets. Anyone of legal drinking age can pick one up. But we don't have the access. People don't have the access to just knowing a bit about it. People want to know about stuff. People are interested and engaged, and we should embrace that on a variety of platforms. We also need to increase visibility of a range of different voices and different looks and different people having their thoughts and opinions on wine, because I do really believe that people are drawn to something when they recognize themselves in it. I thought the pandemic was brilliant because it drove a lot of the wine producers online, and that gave access to a lot more people who didn't go to tasting rooms and didn't have cellars and didn't have wine knowledge, who were stuck inside and go, I'm going to spend a bit more and do a wine tasting online or something like that. The point is, we want to embrace wine education, wine knowledge for everyone. We want to make it something that they want to engage with because it's entertaining and interesting, and part of their daily life of having a glass of wine with a gorgeous meal with their gorgeous friends. That's what we need to just bring everyone into the wine umbrella.
That's a good rallying call.
Yeah.
To wine!
And umbrellas. No, that's great. Well, I think, we've really enjoyed having you. Thank you for making up for some of my... I've had a bit of a headache, if I'm honest, today. So
I want the tagline to be
we haven't brought it around.
You've made up for that, definitely. And really interesting insights. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope we can do some more stuff alongside other things that you're doing this year. And to your point, I think we're in a good space with the market. We've got some interesting avenues to explore around how to further engage people. And Tom, do you want to finish us off?
Yeah, no, just to echo Jay's thoughts. Thank you so much for joining us. I know people at home listening would have really enjoyed that. We had some superb anecdotes in there, and luckily a lot of names were kept private and confidential. So yeah, DM Libby if you want to know who those people are. But yeah, absolutely brilliant having you here. Thank you so much. Superb guest. But yeah, that's it from us. That's our first podcast of the year in the bank, and we hope you carry on listening for the rest of the year because we've got some great content coming up. Now, as you know, we are available on all of your favorite podcast channels. We are available on Spotify. We are available on YouTube as well if you want to look at us whilst we're talking. But if you don't want to look at us, just go to your favorite podcast channel, and all you have to do is have us in your ears, which is painful enough, I know. But look, what we'd love you to do is to we'd love for you to subscribe, and we'd love you to let us know what you think about the podcast. Please get in touch, leave your comments, as long as they're nice. And,
no constructive criticism.
You never know. We might bring up one of your questions on a future podcast. But once again, thank you so much for listening, and we will see you soon.
Thank you very much.
Cheers.